So now we have, of course, here a balled and burlap tree. Of course, you know, they come in three primary ways. Of course, we purchase container trees, balled and burlap, and of course bare root. Obviously the balled and burlap are going to be the larger trees, but it is important when we receive a new balled and burlap tree, of course, to find that established root flare. Kasey just talked in the previous video about how we have to actually establish that before we begin to consider our planting. So before I do anything here, I want to, of course, get down to that flare. Awesome, thank you, sir. And then we can talk a little bit more about how that flare is and how to properly place this into the hole. Okay. Now, one thing I will mention as I'm sitting here using a box blade next to the trunk is trunk injuries on balled and burlap trees are very common because they are such a large tree. Sometimes it can be harder to travel with them, harder to load them, but it is important when we lift the balled and burlap, we're not lifting by that trunk, but instead we lift by the root ball itself. And that may mean utilizing some straps and heavy machinery. So, all right, so now we're down basically to what would be considered grade on the actual balled and burlap tree. Thank you. But we can see, you know, this tree was just recently dug, obviously. So we want to look at this and see if we see that developed root flare. And in fact, on this tree, it's a little bit absent of a root flare here. So I'm going to go ahead and try and get down just slightly to a level where I can see a little bit more of that flare. Now, don't get too worried about damaging a few of these small feeder roots on the top. That's not that big of a deal, but we do want to try and tease them apart out in a radial fashion as we're working along here. But what you'll notice is, you know, you can be aggressive but still be delicate with roots. So it looks like I'm damaging them, but I'm really not. I'm just pulling these apart so that we can orient them into the planting hole easier. So, wow. Yeah, this thing is deep. Let me see if I can. We may need a second.
Yep. Oh. It's down there about another inch or so.
Okay. Yeah.
While Lee's pulling that apart, one thing I will mention, and a lot of people will ask this question, or why am I buying a tree that's already too deep into the hole? And this is a somewhat of a common practice that you're going to find a lot of nurseries. So this tree is planted at the nursery, typically at about a 2 to 3 foot tall whip is what they call it. And when they are putting that into the ground, you know, they're doing it in mass quantity, and a lot of times that will happen really quickly. And so you'll end up with a tree that gets put too far in the ground at the nursery. And then when they come to spade this thing out of the ground, additional soil oftentimes gets put up and around the base of the tree when that spade comes up. So those are two things typically that are going on with this tree. Now, as he's pulling apart this, the other thing I wanted to point out, you see a lot of roots that are circling around the trunk of the tree, and we're simply trying to remove those from around the base in order to make sure we don't have any girdling roots. If left intact around the trunk of the tree like so, that thing can mature to the point where it could eventually, you know, 10, 15 years down the road, start to constrict the growth rate of that tree.
Yeah, so Kasey brings up a good point on the girdling roots, because we think of those more common in our container grown plants, but certainly roots will grow wherever there's dirt and moisture conducive for root growth. So as this one had so much dirt on top, we saw roots actually kind of walking themselves back to a new direction, ultimately coming in contact with that trunk.
will also mention that certain varieties of trees will have a graft and a root flare. So what that means is that certain genetic characteristics of a tree, such as the color in the fall or the form of the tree, will be sought out by the individual who's planting or putting the tree in the ground. And so they genetically try and get those particular traits to be a part of this tree at an adult age. And so you'll oftentimes see that, and this is a Bosque elm for narrow crown. We actually have chosen this tree for this location because there's utility lines on the back here. And it will have a narrow crown and will stay away from the utility lines down the road. And so this first area here is what that actually is. That's the graft. And on down, you'll start to see here is the actual root of the tree. So there's our grafting point and there's our root. You want to still try and get that root at grade level. Yeah, we're probably getting to the point now where we can probably make a measurement and figure out how deep to make this tree.
Kasey, will you show where the dirt was, just so people know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Lee.
Go for it. So yeah, so right where we see this discoloration, that's ultimately, you know, maybe a little bit lower than that, but that's about where our dirt level was when we started this process. Now the banding, of course, added a little bit of that discoloration, but ultimately, as Kasey's mentioned, when that soil just remains in direct contact with that bark, ultimately it degrades it so much so that it separates the bark from the internal wood, and then we see, of course, the tree go into decline soon thereafter.
You can actually see, I'm putting this surveying pin right at the point, and you can see it here. We're right at about 15 inches. And what we're going to be able to do then is measure the depth of our hole to make sure that we're not too deep on that as well. So what works great for this is a rake, a hard rake, and I usually put it on the flat side there and take my stick from the bottom of that hole to see where we're at. And you can see here that we are sitting at about 14 inches right here. And again, what we want to make sure we have is that root ball is at or just above root grade level. And I think we're pretty good here. I like it. If we're a little high, not a problem. I'd rather be an inch high than an inch low. So what we're gonna do is, hopefully between the 5 of us, is be able to shift this. We're not going to take the burlap in the basket off at this point yet. We're gonna get it into the planting hole and then go ahead and start to remove the material as much as we can. Typically trying to remove it about 2/3 of the way is what I suggest. But we'll get it down into that hole and we'll go from there. All right, where's our wire?
The wire basket?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
I've got a piece of it over here.
Okay. Just be careful. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Ah, perfect.
Beautiful.
All right, so what I'm going to do is start removing this wire basket as much as I can get off of there. And like I said, I try and pull what I can out of the root or the planting hole. You have to understand the majority of your root systems on a tree are going to be typically in the top 12 inches. So if we can get that basket below that mark, it goes a long way. You can really get a good picture of this root flare on this tree, and I want to point something out. These here are what we call the scaffold and main roots. You can see where that was buried. We start to have small roots starting to come out of there. That's what we call adventitious roots. They're there because that soil line was piled up too high when this tree was growing in the nursery. Not a big problem. Lee did a great job at preserving a majority of all these fine roots around here. But the ones just above that root flare, when we're done, we'll go ahead and prune those off so they're not a problem down the road. All right, and the last thing we want to do at this point is think about how our tree's oriented and making sure that it's level. I will say that you don't want your tree at a 45-degree angle or anything like that, but trees will tend to find sunlight and correct themselves, but a lot of people will recognize really quickly if you have a crooked tree. And so what works out really well is if somebody, you have two folks or just one person, and go out at two different sides and just try and orient it which direction it needs to go.
You're good here on this side.
So on this side we're looking pretty good.
Looking good over here.
Pretty good, maybe just slightly this way. But
Slightly towards that way. So
yeah.
if you need to move it a certain direction, what works really well is you can pull that root ball on over and then have somebody put some soil and tamp that down on the back side in order to keep it where it needs to go.
Much better. Yep.
At that point, we are ready to go ahead and start putting soil back into the planting.
It's important that
Garrett,
we, of course, orient
jump on in there.
these roots, of course, outward, so we have them in a nice radial fashion. They'll move out into that land.
I can't say enough about how much a garden rake helps moving soil around where you need it to go. It's one of the best tools when it comes to tree planting. Now, what you'll see is we're tampering down. It's good to compact because we don't want too much settling going on. If you don't do any tampering, often what will happen after your first rain is your tree may shift. And so you want to make sure you have some tampering going on around the base of the tree. However, you don't want to over compact. You want to just make sure that you've got enough soil compacted in there that the root ball is not going to go anywhere, and make sure that you're still allowing oxygen and water to penetrate down to the roots as well. So go ahead and grade this out. Yeah, pretty good.
There, yeah.
We will come back after we're back and we'll remove all the sod. So we're trying to move a majority of the sod out of the way, not put that back into our planting hole. But as you can see, if you come up here and look, you can see that root flare is visible on all sides of this tree, and essentially what we've got left are these adventitious roots that will be pruned off when we come around to mulch the tree.